Hello there all, been a while, especially since the first season of Vinland Saga. 4 years, in fact, hauntingly. Hope you've all been well, because Thorfinn certainly hasn't. In that blur of an intervening period, I did actually finally read Vinland's source material and promptly fell deeply in love with it, what with its stellar art and narrative and thematic overtones and all that nonsense that goes with something being considered quite good. So when it was announced that the series adaptation would get a second season, I was ecstatic. I flipped my lid even. There's only one thing I love more than bittersweet stories about meetings and partings, and that's going on quests of vengeance that drown both myself and the people around me in a chaotic maelstrom of devastating, selfish violence. So Vinland's always been very relatable to me. You know, I had hoped, following Chainsaws Man, that the next thing I would review would not immediately start with me saying, well, it's a little bit different than the source material, but here we are, preambulatory fluff notwithstanding. Did you know, gang? Vinland Saga Season 2 is a little bit different from the source material. Not much, mind you, but a little bit. The source material doesn't have a soundtrack, and it doesn't run at 24 frames per second, for example. These are the kinds of stellar insights that come from a razor-sharp, honed, critical edge that comes from making one review of a television show every 3 months. I'm trying to be better about this, I swear. I generally try and review things I like for whatever reason, despite the fact that being relentlessly positive doesn't come very naturally to me. On the one hand, being familiar with the source material made me rather excited for the second season of Vinland. On the other hand, being familiar with the source material made me rather cautious about the second season of Vinland. We truly do contain multitudes, don't we? What complex little creatures we happen to be. Speaking of complex little creatures, the arc this season adapts is specifically the turning point for both the narrative and the protagonist who helms it, Thorfinn. It's a slower arc, a more thoughtful one, where the clamour of the battlefield is traded for the muted ambience of introspection, personal growth, and farming, and as a result is the foundation of everything that comes afterwards for both him and the series. So it was very important for the series as a whole going forwards to get it right. Did they, those wild sons of guns over there at Studio Mappa, who were not Studio Wit, who handled Season 1 even though, owing to Twin Engine, they both featured the same CGI motorcycle guy's logo roll? These people have no brand loyalty, I swear. That pithy observation notwithstanding, did it succeed at what it sets out to do as both an adaptation and a story unto itself? Well, give me a minute to write another 1,500 words or so and we'll try and get at the bottom of that. The second season of Vinland Saga is a very different beast to the first, in its narrative, its structure, and its tone. Perhaps fittingly then, in the lead-up to release, it seemed like every trailer for the season was flooded with comments from manga readers expressing concern that anime-onlys would recoil in terror when they would inevitably find this one a deeply jarring break in form from the first, given that it's a departure in both style and substance from the story that came before. A first season which, in a fantastic little bit of showmanship I'm sure we all very prominently remember, was revealed to be just the prologue to the actual story being told in its 24th and thereby final episode. If Vinland's second season is the start of the series proper, then I'd suggest that it's only fitting that the tone is rather different to the prologue, but I do agree that it's a story wholly unlike the one the first season told, albeit one that couldn't exist without the groundwork that season laid. Whether or not that's a good or a bad thing is going to be down to personal preference, of course, but I certainly think that Vinland's second major arc is an excellent example of a character arc as of time of writing, which is a high bar for an adaptation of it to clear. So, what happened in Season 1? Well, that's the rub. Not too much, really. To summarise, Askeladd, this greasy man here, deep sixed Thorfinn's father, Thor's. That's tough. This is a tough one to say. Deep sixth Thorfinn's father Thor's on the orders of Floki, the world's most rectangularly faced man, when the kid was only 6 or so years old, and the resultant oath of vengeance caused him to descend into an unceasing nightmare of brutal sociopathic violence for 11 years, culminating in the little tyke having a minor slip into near total mental breakdown, symptomatically expressed by slow motion, cathartic music, and a series of sweeping prophetic flash forwards. He's then escorted gently from the premises, and the next few years are lost to the mystery of time skips. They also hung out with Canute in his marketplace of ideas for a little bit along the way, and he had a few epiphanies of his own, like how God can be a bastard sometimes. I'm sure he'd take to the discourse like a duck to water. Season 2 picks up a few years after the close of the first season, with Thorfinn, now a slave in Norway, working hard on the farm of this prick. Wait a minute. This isn't Thorfinn. This is some English schmuck. You know, I don't think this guy's even a Viking. Hang on. Well, look who it is, everyone. It's Einar. You know, the protagonist, Einar. It's Einar, everybody. Einar is, very much like myself, a rowdy, angry, salt-of-the-earth style Englishman, but in a unique twist, he has found himself cast into slavery following an unfortunate tiff with the nearby Norse, who are still doing that whole raiding shtick of theirs they're so fond of. He's more or less the perspective character for the first few episodes, if not the entire season. It's through him that we meet Thorfinn again and see the situation in which the two find themselves, with a set of eyes unclouded by a decade of relentless misery and death, as the little murderer who could begins to undergo what people far smarter than I have described as a character arc, one he was sadly more or less bereft of for the duration of season 1, but that's the shtick, isn't it? You've got to spend an entire season turning him into a fairly one-note maniacal brute so we can redeem him back up in the sequel. Poor guy, never the protagonist in his own franchise. He can hang out with, I don't know, Rayman and Spyro. Rayman. Now, I grew up in a fairly agricultural part of England, as evidenced by my thick West Country drawl, so I was thrilled when I found out that the arc that Vinland's second season is comprised of takes place almost entirely on a big farm full of things that farms have, like wheat and livestock and institutionalized classism. Just like Thorfinn, I too experienced character growth on a farm. Unlike his though, I think I managed to get away with mine. But enough faff, this is a season about the maturation and inheritance of both the literal and metaphoric varieties of how ideals can shape a person, for the better or for the worse, and for how society forces roles on us that we may not agree with. It's also a season about how cool farming is, and how the best salve for a lifetime of pillaging and murdering is to spend a few weeks with a till in your hands in indentured servitude, or something like that. I should probably stop making light of the series themes, given how much they resonated with me, so allow me a quick breath above the water's surface to say that I think this season is exceptionally compelling in its narrative. I admit my bias. I think it's worth reiterating that I did catch up with the manga between the end of the first season and the start of the second, so I knew the story going into this, but I don't feel as though that detracts from just how enjoyable to watch Thorfinn's arc was when I read it, and judging by the reactions of the people I watched it with, how it hit them when they saw it in the adaptation. All the characters are very strong. The core cast of Thorfinn, Einar, Arnheid, Ketil, Olmar, the Old Master, Thorgil, and Snake are as despicable or charming as they need to be, in some cases both, and there are some genuinely incredible moments, even with the season's more placid pacing and meandering, almost episodic narrative centered around emotional growth rather than the adrenaline of action sequences, political machinations, and overall viciousness of the situations the cast found themselves in back in the first. Rather than the vengeance-driven plot and constant threat of brutal violence, Season 2 features a slower, more introspective story about the effects of that first arc on Thorfinn, and something of a deconstruction of what role violence plays in society, coupled with side characters who all had arcs of their own. I particularly enjoyed Olmar, who has a season-long arc from arrogant blowhard to earnest worker as he learns from those around him, but also tellingly comes to some conclusions by himself. It's predictable, but that certainly didn't bar my enjoyment of it. I'd be interested to see if anyone thought this season was preachy, as it's unquestionably idealistic, and the author definitely has a point of view that they are without a doubt expressing, but it's delivered with so much sincerity that you can't help but want to root for Thorfinn and his little crew of farmhands as they stand against the unfairness of their circumstances. It may hit as almost hopelessly naive, but it does feel earned and cathartic in the context of the narrative, if not, you know, the real world. It's great. It's extremely compelling watching. Even if the stakes are nominally lower than they were in the first season, their emotional importance makes the smaller scale conflicts they experience have just as much, if not more, impact. To me, a fistfight with a group of random farmers felt like it had more narrative consequence than any one of the far broader, more intense fights in the first season. You know, duel with Thorkel notwithstanding. That said, it's not without its faults. It absolutely kills me to bring this up, but I really feel like I have to. Even though the soundtrack was composed by the same person, Yutaka Yamada, the original score for the second season pales in comparison to its first. There were definitely a few standout tracks. I don't mean to suggest there aren't, but you can almost tangibly feel the difference when music from the first season's soundtrack is played over anything in its second season, and I wish at the very least they'd been a bit more liberal in using those previous tracks. Perhaps that was the intention. It's a slower, more subdued season, so the soundtrack reflects that, but the difference between the original score and something like Utopia is night and day. They also didn't use it when I was sure they were going to, so it's a big mess overall is what I mean to say. 0 out of 10. Hi, it's me, post-production Aaox. After thinking on it further and listening through the soundtrack in isolation, I'd like to say that I don't actually think the soundtrack is worse than the original seasons per se. Instead, I rather think it's not quite utilized as dramatically as the first seasons. There are a lot of moments in that first season that I literally cannot picture without their soundtrack. Leaf talking to Thorfinn in York, set to somewhere else. Thor's describing Vinland to the runaway slave, set to Utopia. Canut's revelation, set to Flashpoint. The list goes on. Whereas in season 2, I think the soundtrack really takes a back seat, which isn't even necessarily the wrong choice for the more subdued, slower pace of this arc. It's just something I miss personally. Anyway, back to the back to the video. As before though, Thorfinn's voice acting was very good. What Yuto Uemura sold as white-hot fury and almost animalistic rage in the first season has transitioned excellently into new Thorfinn, and it works very well. Snake, Olmar and Einar are standouts as well, even if the direction for emotional turmoil seems to have been try and sound like you've been constipated for the past month. There's a lot of great delivery here. As stated previously, Farmland Saga is carried by its narrative rather than its animation. Things feel more stiff here than the first season. There's a touch less detail, and I was rarely struck by the artistic direction. Nothing quite compares to, say, the scene of Leif and Thorfinn talking in the jail in York, for example. I never really got used to seeing the faceless versions of these characters as they stood in the background especially.
They took my face!
It's fair to say that Vinland's second season's animation is a step down, but not a hugely dramatic one, and it's rarely presented a barrier to enjoyment. That's certainly not to say there weren't parts that stood out to me as well. The focus on scars, and in particular hands, was a very well-considered choice. It's a season about hard labor and the price of violence, and what better way to show that than by zooming the camera in so far we can see the pores on Thorfinn's thumb. Vinland's second arc is a hell of a thing, and it's one I dearly enjoy in both its iterations. I think what stood out to me most when I read it is that it doesn't suggest that finding the motive to redeem yourself is enough. It demands you have the willpower to see it through. Thorfinn acknowledging his past transgressions is one thing, and swearing to never hurt anyone again is another, but actually living that decision is a much more dramatic undertaking, and the narrative doesn't mind pushing his conviction to the brink on more than one occasion. Despite its idealism, I find myself very invested in it. Thorfinn might be naive, but it's an inspiring sort of naivete. We know Thorfinn's quest to establish a nation in Vinland without war or slavery is a lost cause from the outset, living, as we do, in the cruel maelstrom of the present, and his endeavor can't possibly end well for anyone involved, and yet the series depicts the act of wanting to pursue that as enough in and of itself. Makoto Yukimura said once in an interview with Kodansha Comics that he wanted to write a shonen where the protagonist didn't solve all of his problems with violence, and instead of depicting him as pacifistic from the outset, he wrote nigh 50 chapters of the protagonist attempting to do exactly that. So his turn to a more pacifistic outlook feels, more than anything else, hugely earned. There's nothing wrong with fiction that suggests we can be better than our circumstances. If you want to watch people pummel each other to death, there's 1,000 other shows that have that, and there's nothing much wrong with that either, but very few approach violence like Vinland does, and I think that's worth something.